The night my husband raised his hand against me, the whole table went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that means people are shocked. The kind of quiet that means everyone already knew who he was and nobody planned to stop him. I sat there for 3 full seconds and I did not cry, did not scream, did not reach for my face even though it was burning. I had learned long ago how to keep still when something broke inside me. What Marcus did not know, what none of them knew sitting around that long dining table with their good china and their proud smiles, was that the building they were eating inside, the neighborhood surrounding it, the commercial properties lining the street just outside that window, all of it was registered under one name. My father's name. And my father had been watching everything for much longer than any of them realized. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something real. If the person who was supposed to protect you became the one you needed protection from, and the family around you saw it and looked away, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace, or would you have finally let the truth speak for itself? Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything, and I think you are going to understand exactly why Lousia made the choice she did. My name is Lousia, and I want to start with something most people never say out loud. The loneliest place I have ever been was not an empty room. It was a crowded dinner table surrounded by people who claimed to love me while treating me like I owed them something just for being there. I grew up in a quiet house with a father who never wasted words but never wasted actions either. My father, Edmund, was a man who built things. Not in the loud, boastful way some men do, where they want every person in the room to know their net worth before the soup arrives. My father built quietly. He bought land when land was not fashionable. He developed commercial properties in small towns that later became bigger towns. He held on when other investors sold. He let his work speak, and he kept his private life exactly that. Private. He raised me to do the same. He raised me to be humble, hardworking, and careful about who I let into my life. I listened to everything except the last part. I met Marcus Hale when I was 27. He was charming in the way that a well-lit room is charming. Everything felt warm, every corner felt safe, and you did not notice until you were deep inside it that there were no windows. Marcus worked in sales for a mid-sized equipment company. He had a good laugh and strong opinions, and he made me feel, for the first time in a long time, like someone wanted to know what I thought. I had spent so many years being the dependable one, the quiet one, the daughter who kept things running without making noise, that when someone looked directly at me and asked what I wanted, I fell toward it like I had been leaning all my life, and suddenly the wall moved. We dated for 14 months. In that time, I met his family 3 times. Each meeting was pleasant enough on the surface. His mother, Renata Hale, was a woman who smiled with her mouth and assessed with her eyes. His father, Gerald, shook hands too firmly and told stories about himself. His younger sister, Darcy, was the kind of beautiful that she used like a credential. They were all polite. They were all watching. I did not understand yet what they were watching for. Marcus proposed on a Saturday evening in November with a ring that was too small for my finger and a speech that sounded slightly rehearsed, like he had practiced it, but only halfway. I said yes anyway. I told myself the warmth was real even if the details felt slightly borrowed from somewhere else. I told myself love does not have to be perfect to be true. I was right about that. But I was wrong about who I was saying yes to. We married the following spring. The wedding was small by any standard, which suited me because my father had always believed in keeping important things quiet. Marcus wanted more guests. Marcus wanted a bigger venue. Marcus made several comments in the months before the wedding about how my father could certainly afford a grander event, and each time I redirected the conversation because I had been raised not to make my father's work into a performance. On the day itself, my father walked me down the aisle of a small garden venue with 60 guests, and he squeezed my hand at the altar and said one sentence quietly enough that only I heard it. He said, "You can always come home." At the time, I thought it was just a father being sentimental. Later, I understood it was something closer to a warning dressed in love. The first year of marriage was the year of small erosions. These are the things that are very hard to explain to someone who has not lived them, because each individual moment seems so minor. Marcus would speak over me at dinner with his friends and then laugh when I tried to finish my sentence. He would tell his family stories about my life that were almost accurate but slightly off in ways that made me look less capable, less interesting, or more dependent on him than I was. He would refer to my work. I had been quietly managing several of my father's administrative accounts alongside my own part-time consulting work as my little projects. He said it with affection, which made it harder to name. He said it with a smile that never reached correction. His mother, Renata, began calling more frequently in the second year. She had opinions about how I ran the household, about when we should visit, about what the family expected from a daughter-in-law. She called these expectations tradition. I called them instructions, but only to myself. I followed most of them because I had been raised to be respectful, and because I did not yet understand that following instructions for people who see your compliance as weakness is not grace. It is an invitation for more. His sister Darcy would visit and leave things slightly rearranged. She would comment on the curtains, on the kitchen organization, on how I kept the guest room. Never directly critical, always just suggestive, just wondering aloud if maybe things would work better a different way. Marcus never redirected her. Marcus would nod along or laugh softly, and when I raised it later, he would tell me I was being sensitive. Sensitive became a word I associated with the feeling of knowing exactly what was happening and being told I was imagining it. The second year was when the money conversations started. Marcus began talking more openly about wanting to expand. He wanted to move out of the apartment into a house. A specific house, actually. A large one in a neighborhood about 20 minutes north of where we lived. He had ideas about the kind of life he wanted, and those ideas were significantly larger than his salary allowed. He had not asked me directly about my father, but he began framing things. He would mention the house and then pause and look at me in a way that was clearly an invitation for me to fill in the gap. I did not fill it. My father had not raised me to hand out his work like it was a gift to whoever happened to marry me. By the third year, I had grown quieter than I had ever been in my own home. I was managing the household. I was helping Marcus build his professional network through introductions I made carefully and never loudly. I was preparing meals for family visits that came frequently and left the kitchen a site of recovery. And I was keeping a smile in place at the dinner table that no longer reflected anything true underneath it. I had become exactly what my father had taught me not to be. I had become invisible inside a room I was supposed to belong to. The night of the incident was a Sunday in October. Renata had organized a family dinner at the Hale House, which was a large colonial-style home that Gerald had purchased 30 years ago in a neighborhood that had appreciated considerably. 12 people at the table. Marcus's parents, his sister Darcy and her boyfriend of the moment, 2 uncles, their wives, a cousin, and me. I had brought a dish, something I had made from scratch that morning, and when Renata set the table, she placed my dish at the far end away from the centerpieces, as if it were a minor supplement rather than a full contribution. The conversation moved the way Hale family conversations always moved. Gerald held the floor and the rest of the table orbited him. Marcus performed his best version of himself, the charming son, the strong husband, the man with a plan. He made comments about his ambitions for the coming year. He talked about growth. He used words like leverage and equity in ways that were slightly imprecise but sounded impressive at the table. I sat beside him and offered nothing because I had learned that when I contributed something real, it was either minimized or quietly claimed. About halfway through the main course, Renata made a comment about one of her friend's daughters who had recently come into a family inheritance and used it to help her husband start a business. The comment hung in the air for a moment, and then several people at the table turned slightly toward me in the way people do when something is being said for a specific audience. I did not respond. I kept my expression steady and I reached for my water glass. Marcus laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was the kind of laugh that sounds like it is performing comfort but is actually performing embarrassment. He said something about how some people keep things very close, and he glanced at me when he said it, and Gerald laughed too, and Darcy smiled her careful smile. And then something small cracked inside the dinner and Marcus, still laughing slightly, made a comment about how maybe if I spent less time managing his expectations and more time managing opportunities, we would all be bet. Off. The table laughed again a little louder, and I looked at my plate. I do not know exactly what happened in the next 20 seconds. I only know what I felt and what I saw. I reached across the table to correct something, to move my dish closer to center, a small gesture of dignity in a moment that had taken most of mine. And Marcus turned sharply, and his hand came across fast and open, and it caught the side of my face before anyone could process it, including him. The table went completely silent, not the silence of horror. The silence of people deciding in real time whether to pretend they had not seen it. Renata picked up her fork. Gerald cleared his throat. Darcy looked at her plate. The two uncles exchanged a glance. The cousin looked at the ceiling, and Marcus sat back in his chair and said, quietly and too calmly, that I should not have startled him like that. I sat still for 3 full seconds. I told you this at the beginning because those 3 seconds are the ones I want you to understand. I was not frozen in fear. I was deciding. In those 3 seconds, I felt every month of quiet erosion, every redirected sentence, every little project, every dinner I had prepared and conversation I had managed and invitation I had declined to protect other people's comfort, and I made a decision. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way my father had taught me to make important decisions, quietly and completely. I stood up from the table. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I picked up my bag, which was on the chair behind me. I looked once at the table at 12 people who had all just chosen what they would do when given the chance, and I walked out of that dining room, through the front door, and I sat in my car for 4 minutes until my breathing was even. Then I drove home. I did not call Marcus that night. He called me twice, and I let both calls go. I sat in our apartment, and I did what I always did when things became very clear. I called my father. Edmund Carver answered on the second ring. He always answered on the second ring for me. I told him what happened without elaboration, the way he had taught me to report things accurately. I told him about the dinner, about the comment, about the hand. There was a pause on the line that lasted about 5 seconds. My father did not express outrage loudly. He asked me one question. He asked me if I was safe right now. I said yes. He said, "Good, then we have time to be careful." And he told me to sleep, and that he would call me in the morning. I did not sleep easily, but I understood something clearly for the first time in 3 years. I had been trying to earn a place in a room that had never fully opened its door to me. I had been operating under the belief that if I was patient enough, helpful enough, small enough, something would eventually shift, and they would see me clearly. What I understood that night was that they did see me clearly. They had seen me all along. They had simply decided that what they saw did not require their respect. Marcus came home at midnight. He was not angry. He was conciliatory in the specific way that people are when they know they have crossed a line they cannot easily uncross. He said he was sorry. He said he had not meant to. He said the situation had escalated and he had reacted without thinking. He said all the things that are technically apologies but contain no actual reckoning. I listened. I said I understood. I did not say I forgave him. I went asleep. My father called the next morning at 7:30. He told me that over the next few days I should gather any documents related to our joint accounts, any property agreements that had my name on them, and any records of financial contributions I had made to household costs since we married. He did not explain immediately why, but my father had never asked me to do something without a reason, so I began. What I found over the following 4 days was clarifying. I had, over the course of our marriage, contributed significantly more to our shared financial life than Marcus had acknowledged or that his family had any awareness of. I had been managing accounts quietly, paying into savings, handling insurance, and covering several household costs entirely on my own as my consulting income grew. Marcus had always made it seem like we were splitting things evenly. We were not. But I had never demanded credit for it because I had been raised to build, not to perform. The more significant discovery was not about our apartment. It was about the building. 6 months before Marcus and I married, my father had purchased a commercial and mixed-use building in the neighborhood where the Hale family home was located. It was not the house itself, but it was the commercial strip at the base of the neighborhood, including the small grocery that Gerald Hale frequented, the hardware store where he had an account, and the parking structure attached to both. My father had purchased it as a long-term hold. He had not told me at the time because he did not mix his work into my personal life unless it became relevant. He told me now because it had become relevant. Edmund also told me something I had not known. 2 years into our marriage, Marcus had contacted my father's property management company directly. He had called representing himself as my husband and had asked about available commercial lease space in the building, suggesting that my father would certainly offer favorable terms given the family connection. My father's office had logged the inquiry and flagged it. They had not responded. My father had not told me because he had not wanted to inject business into my marriage before I was ready to see it for myself. He was now telling me because I had shown him I could see clearly. I sat with this information for 2 full days. Marcus had gone to my father's building, using my name as a credential, looking for an advantage he felt entitled to because he had married me. He had done this without telling me, without asking me, without even considering that my father was a man who logged everything. He had simply assumed that my value to him was transactional and that the transaction was available on request. On the 3rd day after the dinner, Renata called me. She had been thinking. She wanted to smooth things over. She said Marcus was under a lot of pressure and that sometimes when men are under pressure, they react in ways that are not ideal. She said the family was hoping I would not make more of this than it needed to be. She said very carefully that family harmony mattered and that I had always seemed like a sensible girl. Sensible, not a woman with a mind, a girl with sense. I thanked her for calling and told her I was still processing, which was true, and I ended the call. Darcy texted 2 hours later. She said she hoped I was doing okay. She said Marcus felt terrible. She added, and this is the part I want you to pay attention to, that she hoped I remembered how much the family had welcomed me and how much they had done for me over the years. She listed things, the holidays, the gatherings, the being included. She sent this as if inclusion were a debt I owed and being struck at the dinner table was a reasonable invoice. I forwarded both communications to my father. He read them and called me and said only, "They are not worried about you. They are managing you." I already knew this, but hearing him say it made something in my chest loosen. I had spent 3 years second-guessing my own perception in that family. My father's clarity was the first honest mirror I had been given in a very long time. Marcus asked me over the following week if we could talk, really talk. I agreed to sit with him in the living room on a Thursday evening. He came in with the manner of someone who had prepared. He said he had been thinking a great deal. He said he knew he had to do better. He said he wanted to understand what it would take to rebuild trust. These were not bad words. They might have been enough if they had not come after 3 years of small erosions. I looked at him across the living room, and I asked him one question. I asked him why he had contacted my father's property company without telling me. The color changed in his face, not all at once. Gradually, the way light changes in a room when a cloud moves. He said he had only been exploring options. He said it was meant to be a surprise. I asked him what kind of surprise involves using my family name to seek financial leverage with my father's company without my knowledge or consent. He had no answer that made sense. He reached for several, and each one fell short. I watched him reach, and I felt something I can only describe as the last piece of a complicated picture settling into its correct position. I was not angry in the way I might have expected. I was simply done with the confusion. The picture was whole now. The marriage I had believed I was building was not the marriage I had been living in. I had been an asset in a plan I had not been shown. My warmth, my family connections, my quiet financial management, my patience, my name, had all been useful to Marcus in ways that had nothing to do with loving me. I called a solicitor the following Monday. I did not discuss this with Marcus. I had learned, from watching my father work for 30 years, that important decisions do not require an audience before they are ready to be made. I found someone thorough, someone recommended by my father's company, and I began understanding what my actual options were. The legal picture was more straightforward than I had feared. Because I had been careful about keeping records, because I had documented my financial contributions, and because the apartment we lived in was leased in my name alone, a fact that had happened by administrative circumstance when we first moved in and that Marcus had never corrected, my position was considerably stronger than it might have appeared from the outside. Marcus, I think, believed during this period that we were still in the negotiation phase. He bought flowers twice. He made dinners twice, both of which were slightly burnt and slightly proud. He showed me things he had printed from the internet about couples counseling. He was performing the idea of effort. I watched it the way I had learned to watch things in that family. Carefully, without reaction, without cruelty, and without any signal that would allow him to readjust the performance. 3 weeks after the dinner, Renata came to the apartment. She did not call ahead. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon when she had calculated, correctly, that Marcus would still be at work. She sat in my living room and she told me, very directly, that she was worried about her son. She said she thought I was being cold. She said she thought I was holding a moment over his head instead of choosing forgiveness. She said she had seen marriages survive far worse. I asked her what she meant by far worse. She gave me several examples that involved things women had apparently endured and recovered from, as if endurance were the measure of success in a marriage. I listened to all of it, and then I asked her something I had never asked her before. I asked her what she thought had been asked of me over the 3 years of our marriage, in terms of what I had given, what I had managed, what I had absorbed, and what I had been given in return. She looked at me differently for a moment, as if she had not expected me to be the one asking questions. Then she composed herself and said that was not the point. I told her gently and clearly that it was exactly the point, and that I appreciated her coming but that I needed her to leave now. She left. She did not look comfortable doing it. The next significant moment came from an unexpected direction. One of the uncles at the dinner, Marcus's mother's brother, a man named Ron who I had always found to be the most straightforward person in that family, called me 4 weeks after the dinner. He said he wanted to speak without being in the middle of family politics. He said he had been thinking about what happened at the dinner. He said he was ashamed of how everyone had responded, including himself, and that he was sorry. He did not make it about Marcus. He did not make it about family harmony. He said he had a daughter and that he had spent 4 weeks thinking about what he would want for her if she had been sitting in that chair. That was all he said. I thanked him. It mattered more than he probably understood, not because it changed anything in the legal or practical sense, but because it was the first honest acknowledgement from inside that family that something real had happened. I had not imagined it. I had not startled Marcus. I had not made something out of nothing. Something had happened, and at least one person in that family was willing to sit with the truth of it. 5 weeks after the dinner, my father told me he would be coming to the city for a business matter. He needed to meet with the management team overseeing his property portfolio in that area. He would be visiting the building in the Hales neighborhood, among others. This was a routine visit. My father made these visits several times a year. But because of what had recently come to light, this particular visit had a different texture for everyone involved. I did not orchestrate anything. I want to be clear about that. My father was not coming to make a scene. Edmund Carver did not make scenes. He came to do what he always did, which was inspect his investments, meet his managers, review the conditions of his properties, and make quiet decisions about the future. The fact that one of his properties happened to be the commercial strip that Gerald Hale walked past every morning on his way to get his newspaper was simply geography. What happened was this. Gerald Hale, on the morning of my father's visit, happened to be speaking with the manager of the grocery store, apparently asking about a billing issue related to his account there. The manager mentioned, without any particular drama, that the owner was on site for a quarterly review that day. Gerald, being Gerald, expressed interest in meeting the owner because Gerald liked to know who the important people in his neighborhood were. The manager brought my father out to say hello. Edmund Carver shook Gerald Hale's hand. Gerald did not recognize the name immediately. He introduced himself and made a comment about the property, the kind of complimentary remark that landowners often receive. My father thanked him politely. Then Gerald, in the way that Gerald always did everything, began to establish his own importance. He mentioned his neighborhood, his history there, his family. He mentioned, and this is the part that I am told became very still very quickly, his son's wife. He said his son had married a lovely young woman named Lousia. He said it the way people say things they expect will open doors. He clearly expected my father to be a stranger who might respond with polite curiosity. My father looked at him for a moment. Then he said, very quietly and without any particular emphasis, "I know, she's my daughter." Gerald's expression, from what the manager described to me later in a message I still have, was one of slow and complete rearrangement. Like a man watching a room he thought he owned resolve into something entirely different around him. My father did not say anything else dramatic. He returned to his inspection. He thanked the manager and went about his day. Gerald called Marcus within the hour. Marcus called me. I did not answer. Marcus sent a message saying we needed to talk urgently. I sent back 3 words. I know. I let that sit. What happened over the following 72 hours in the Hale family, I was not present for. But I know the general shape of it because Ron told me later, and because some of it reached me through other channels. There was apparently a significant conversation between Gerald and Renata about how much they did not know. There was, I am told, a secondary conversation between Renata and Marcus that involved her asking him why he had not made it clearer to the family who Lousia's father actually was. Marcus, for his part, apparently said that he had not thought it was relevant. This is the part that I find most revealing, not because he hid it, though he did, but because he genuinely had not thought it was relevant. He had not thought who my father was mattered because he had not thought who I was mattered, beyond what I could offer to the plan. My father's work was only interesting to him as a resource. My father as a person, as someone who had raised me and shaped me and watched me and would always answer on the second ring, had not factored into the calculation at all. Marcus came to the apartment that evening. He was different, not in the way of actual understanding, not yet, but in the way of sudden recalculation. He wanted to know why I had not told his family about my father. I asked him if he thought that was the most important question available to him right now. He tried a different approach. He said he thought we could still fix this, that this did not have to define the marriage, that we could start fresh. I asked him if starting fresh included explaining why he had called my father's property company using my name without my knowledge. He said that had been a mistake in judgment. I asked him when he had planned to tell me about it. He did not have an answer. I asked him if he thought I was someone who should be managed. He said that was not what he had done. I asked him to look me in the eye and say that. He looked somewhere in my direction and said it in the way that people say things they know are not true, but cannot yet afford to admit. I told Marcus that I had spoken with a solicitor. I told him that the apartment lease was in my name. I told him that I had documentation of my financial contributions over the 3 years, and that I intended to be very precise going forward. I told him none of this was an act of revenge. It was an act of record. I was simply making sure the truth was in writing, since it had apparently not mattered when it was only lived. He sat very still for a long time after I said this. The performing stopped. The flowers and the printouts and the burnt dinners and the careful apologies all fell away, and I saw, for the first time in a very long time, something honest in the room. Marcus looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he had not expected and was only now realizing how long he had been walking in the wrong direction. He asked me if there was any way forward. I told him I did not know yet. I told him that was an honest answer, and that honest answers were something I intended to keep prioritizing from now on. He nodded. He left. Over the next 3 weeks, a great deal happened at a quiet but persistent pace. My solicitor and I began the preliminary paperwork. I moved several of my personal accounts, the ones that had been technically joint but practically mine, into my own name exclusively. I informed the building management that I would be assuming the lease going forward as the sole named tenant. I reached out to the 2 clients I had been managing through my consulting work and made sure my business structure was correctly registered in my name and my name alone. I also had one conversation with my father that I want to tell you about, because it mattered to me in a way that the legal and financial work did not. I called Edmund on a Sunday morning. I asked him why he had never told me about the property near the Hale house when we were first married. He was quiet for a moment, the way he always was before he said something true. He told me that he had never wanted his work to be the reason I stayed or left any situation. He said that he had watched me for 30 years choose things based on my own values, and he had not wanted me to suddenly start filtering my life through his assets. He said he wanted me to leave Marcus, if that was what I chose to do, because of what Marcus had done, not because of what my father owned. He said the property was his life's work, not mine, and my life was my own. I sat with that for a long time. My father had spent our whole lives quietly making sure I had freedom without giving me the weight of obligation that sometimes comes with wealth. He wanted me to be my own person. What he had not anticipated, and what neither of us had fully understood, was that Marcus had wanted me precisely as an access point to something he saw as larger than me. Renata called one more time. This time the energy was different. She was careful in a way that she had not been before. She said she wanted to apologize for her role in things. She said she should have spoken up at the dinner table. She said she hoped I could understand that the family cared about me. I listened. I thanked her. I told her I appreciated the words. I did not tell her that an apology at this stage felt like an action taken because the address had been revealed. I did not need to say it. She could feel it. The conversation ended politely. Darcy sent a message. She did not mention the building or my father. She said she missed me. She said she hoped we could have lunch sometime. She sent a photograph of a restaurant she liked. I looked at that photograph for a long time. There was something almost touching about it, the way she was still operating as if the only shift had been emotional and that a lunch could rebalance the scales. I did not respond to the lunch invitation. I sent back one line that said I needed more time. This was true. Gerald called my father. My father told me about this later with a brevity that told me everything. Gerald had called to explain that he hoped there were no hard feelings and that he had always thought very highly of Lousia. My father told him he appreciated the call. He did not offer anything further. He was not rude. He was simply not a man who accepted reframing as currency. He did not hold hard feelings. He also did not pretend the conversation had been about anything other than what it was. Gerald had called because the building existed, not because his son had struck a woman at a dinner table. My father knew the difference. I had always known the difference. Now everyone knew that we knew. 60 days after the dinner, the separation was formally underway. Marcus moved into a short-term rental. He was not asked to leave violently or loudly. I gave him 2 weeks to arrange the move, and he arranged it. On his last evening in the apartment, he sat in the kitchen and asked me one more time if I was certain. I told him I was. He asked if I had ever loved him. I told him the truth. I said I had loved who I believed him to be, and that I had held on to that belief longer than the evidence supported, because I had not wanted to be right about what I was seeing. I said loving something that was not quite real was still a real feeling, but it was not a reason to continue. He left the next morning. He took what was his. He did not take more because the documentation existed and he knew it. There was no final dramatic confrontation. There was no raised voice, no thrown objects, no explosive exit. The door simply closed, and then the apartment was quiet in a way I had not felt in 3 years. I stood in the kitchen that morning for about 10 minutes just breathing. I made coffee. I opened the window. The city sounded like itself for the first time in a long time, like something moving forward rather than something held in place. In the months that followed, I learned something I had not expected. The quiet I had thought I was building inside that marriage, the daily effort to smooth things and keep things, the energy I had poured into making the Hale family comfortable, had been exhausting me in ways I had not named because I had never stopped long enough to count the cost. With that, weight lifted the amount of mental and creative space that returned to me was almost disorienting. I started working more fully on my own consulting practice. I began taking on larger accounts. I reorganized several of my father's administrative systems that had grown complicated and streamlined them in ways his team had been trying to accomplish for years. I ran 6 mornings a week in the early hours. I called friends I had allowed to drift. I cooked for myself without an audience, and it turned out I was a good cook when the kitchen was mine. I do not want to make it sound simple, because it was not. There were nights that first month that were very difficult, not because I missed Marcus exactly. I missed the idea of the life I had believed I was building. I missed the version of events where the warmth in that November proposal had been completely genuine, and the dinner table had always been a safe place, and the choice to say yes had led to something real. Grieving the truth of a relationship is different from grieving the person, and I had to learn the difference slowly. Some nights I felt very clearly what I had lost. Other nights I felt with equal clarity what I had kept. My own judgment, my own name, my own accounts, my own value, which had never actually required anyone's recognition to be real. My father visited the city again in the spring. He took me to dinner at a quiet restaurant he liked. He asked me how I was doing, and I told him honestly. I told him the difficult parts and the better parts. He listened the way he always did, without filling the space with reassurance, without rushing toward conclusion. When I finished, he asked me what I had learned. I thought about it for a moment. I told him I had learned that patience is a virtue, but silence is sometimes a strategy that other people benefit from more than you do. He considered this. He said he thought I was right about that. He said he wished he had told me more clearly when I was younger that being humble about your value and being silent about it are very different things, and one of them protects you while the other only protects everyone else. I wrote that down later. I still have it. 8 months after the dinner, I received a message from Marcus. Not about reconciliation. He had moved past that phase. The message was about the property, specifically about a lease opportunity in my father's building. He had a new venture, a small business he was starting, and he had heard through someone that there was commercial space available on the ground floor. He wanted to know if I could put in a word. He wrote it casually, as if this were a reasonable follow-up to our history. As if the most natural next chapter after the marriage was a professional favor from the family he had treated like a convenience. I read the message twice. Then I forwarded it to my father's property office and told them to process it like any other inquiry, through the standard application system, with no adjustments for family connection. Because there was no longer a family connection. There was only a man with a business idea submitting a form. My father's office sent the standard response. The space had already been leased to someone else. Marcus received the automatic notification, and I heard nothing further from him for a long time. Darcy reached out once more, about 10 months after the dinner. This time she was more honest than I had expected her to be. She said she knew things had not been right for a long time in the family, and that she had chosen silence when she should not have. She said she did not expect forgiveness, but she wanted me to know she thought I had been treated badly. She asked if she could reach out occasionally just to stay in touch, not as a representative of her family, but as herself. I thought about that for several days before I responded. I told her I appreciated her honesty and that I needed more time before I could assess what kind of contact felt right. I told her I would let her know. That was the honest answer, and I gave it without apology. The door was not slammed. It was simply not yet opened. And that was mine to decide, on my timeline, for my reasons. I moved to a larger apartment in the late spring of that year. My own name on the lease, my own design on the walls, my own rhythm in every room. I hung 2 photographs in the hallway. One was a photograph of my father at a groundbreaking event for a building he had completed when I was 12. He's looking directly at the camera with the expression of a man who has done something true. The other photograph is one I took myself during a morning run the first week after Marcus left. It is just a street in the early light, empty except for one long shadow on the pavement. My shadow. I hung it there because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be the only person in the frame and feel completely fine about it. My consulting practice grew steadily through that year. By the end of it, I had taken on 4 long-term clients and hired a part-time assistant to help with coordination. I had also begun advising on 2 of my father's development projects, not as a legacy position, but as someone who had demonstrated real competence over time and earned the role on the work. Edmund and I had always had a clear understanding that my involvement in his business had to be earned, not given, and that understanding had never changed. It just meant that when the earning happened, it was real. Ron, the uncle who had called me with his honest apology, reached out occasionally. He had a daughter named Petra who was dealing with a complicated situation in her own relationship, and he sometimes asked if I would be willing to speak with her. I said yes when I had the capacity, not as advice-giving, simply as someone who understood the texture of a long, slow erosion. ND could say clearly that naming it was not disloyalty. Naming it was survival. I do not keep track of what the Hale family is doing. I do not need to. Gerald still walks past my father's building every morning, or so I imagine. The grocery store is still there. The hardware store still has his account, or perhaps not. I do not know. What I know is that the building was bought quietly and held quietly, and that it was never intended as a weapon. My father built things because he believed in building. The fact that what he built turned out to matter in unexpected ways to unexpected people was not a revenge. It was simply reality, arriving in its own time, as it always does. Marcus, I heard through a mutual acquaintance, has started a small business in a different part of the city. I hope it does well. That is not irony. I mean it honestly. He was not only a person who used me, he was also a person who believed his own version of the plan, and plans that are built on a wrong foundation are their own kind of suffering. I do not need him to fail to feel secure in my own life. My security stopped depending on his outcomes the morning he left the apartment, and the door closed, and I stood in the kitchen breathing and making coffee and listening to the city. I think about my father on Sunday mornings the most. He is still working. He does not slow down in the way people expect men of his age to. He finds a new piece of land and he thinks about what could be built there, and he meets with engineers and planners and he keeps building. He calls me twice a week. He still answers on the second ring when I call him. Some things do not change. The lesson I want to leave with is this. I spent a long time believing that being underestimated was something I needed to correct by working harder, being more patient, making myself smaller so that the people around me would eventually have room to grow into seeing me clearly. What I learned was that some people are not failing to see you. They are choosing not to. And the difference between those two things changes everything about what your response should be. I am Lousia Carver. My father built things quietly for 30 years. I was raised in that same ethic of quiet building, of doing the work without the announcement, of letting reality speak when the time came. And when the time finally came, I did not need to speak loudly at all. I only needed to stop being silent about the wrong things. The dinner table that changed everything was the last meal I ever sat through pretending it did not matter. Every table I sit at now is one I have chosen, and the chair is mine. There is a version of Lousia's story that ends differently, and I think you know exactly what I mean. The version where she goes back to that table and keeps being small and useful and quiet until the pattern erodes her completely. I am asking you today to think about whether you have ever been in a room where you felt the pressure to shrink, to absorb, to excuse, to wait for recognition that was never actually coming. If Lousia's story landed somewhere true for you, I want to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me the moment you decided to stop being the one who kept the peace at the cost of your own. This channel exists because these stories are real and because you deserve to feel seen in them.